Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. 3 days after the budget was presented, we ask, how effectively does it tackle the economic problems India faces? And secondly, when you look at the fine print of the budget, does it change the overall impression we got on the day the budget was presented? And if the answer is yes, how substantial is the change? Those are the key issues I shall discuss today with the country director of the International Growth Centre, India's former Chief Statistician, and one of the country's foremost economists, Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, let me start with a sentence right from the very beginning of the finance minister's budget speech. I believe it was her way of characterizing the state of the economy before she announced her budget measures. She said, "The Indian economy is on the right track and heading towards a bright future." Before I come to the details of the budget, do you accept that as an accurate description of the state of the economy?
It's a bright present. Future is yet to evolve. Karan, this is something we've talked about even last time we talked about it, which is corporate India has been doing very well and it continues to do well. And if you just follow the data that comes available to us on a regular basis, which essentially reflects what's happening to corporate India, India is doing very well now. But until and unless the MSMEs come up, this is not a sustainable model.
So when you say it's a bright present for corporate India, not for MSMEs.
Yes, so if you look at all the macro indicators, they look very nice. So if that's what you're going by, yes. The question is, how are you extrapolating it?
And in fact, the finance minister one step further. She said, we're heading towards a bright future. To that you're saying, we don't know as yet.
We don't know as yet. There are some green shoots, but we have time and again seen green shoots wither away.
So you disagree with her on two counts. First of all, if it is a bright present, it is so for corporates, not MSMEs. And MSMEs are, after all, 30% of our economy, 40% of employment. And when she refers to the future being bright, your answer is, we don't know. There may be green shoots, but they've withered in the past and they can wither again.
Yes.
We have to simply wait and see.
Yes.
Okay. Against that background, let's come to the key measures announced by the finance minister in her budget. And first, capital investment by the central government will increase by 33% to 10 lakh crore, amounting to 3.3% of GDP. Now, on its own, that's very impressive.
Oh, indeed. Indeed.
But I'm told that when you look at the fine print, the picture starts to change. For instance, Subhash Garg, the former finance secretary, says that of that figure of 10 lakh crore, 83,000 or 8.3% is actually money intended for BPCL and BSNL, and that clearly must be budgetary support, not capital investment. And secondly, Ratin Roy, the managing director of the Overseas Development Institute, says that the increase in the central government's Capex is matched by an equivalent reduction in PSU Capex. So my question is simple. How real and credible is the claim that government Capex is increased by 10 lakh crore?
Well, Ratin has a point. And this is stark. What we do know is that for the last several years, the government has systematically taken funds out of the PSUs. So the PSUs have no reserves of their own for future investment. So if anything has to happen to PSUs, the government has to step in. Now, clearly the government hasn't done that. What it has done is that it's left the PSUs to their own devices, which means that their investments have fallen, and used the funds that it has collected to ramp up government investment. So the public sector investment is not, as Rathan rightly says, is not that different from last year.
In fact,
only the government part of it which is high.
Let me at this point quote what Rathan Roy said the day after the budget in the Business Standard on the 2nd of February. The combined capital outlay of the central government as well as central public sector enterprises is 3.9% of GDP, exactly the same as in financial year 20.
That's right. That's exactly the point I was trying to make as well.
So that figure of 10 lakh crore, which he was very proud about and which thrilled the stock market, is actually a little misleading, because it was 10 lakh crore, it has taken over and cannibalized PSU Capex and given it to the government.
Yes.
And that is the misleading element of it.
Yes. Now, it's misleading to the extent that the nature of the Capex that takes place under the two, the government on one hand and the PSUs on the other, are very different.
Absolutely.
Right? So the PSUs invest in actual production capacity. The government invests in infrastructure.
But what has happened that the accumulation of 10 lakh crore in the government's hands has come by ensuring that the PSUs have no money left.
That's right.
What about the point made by Subhash Garg that of this 10 lakh crore, 83,000, which is 8.3%, is not an insignificant percentage, is actually money intended for BPCL and BSNL. And therefore, it's budgetary support, not capital investment.
Well, it depends on the use to which it would be put. Now, in both cases, these are listed companies, and the government is probably putting in its equivalent of equity. Now, that may not necessarily translate to Capex, but in the government's book of accounts,
it is Capex.
It is Capex.
But that's an accounting technique.
It's an accounting definition, yes.
Absolutely.
That's
it
right.
may not be genuine Capex, but it will be accounted
It will
Capex,
depend on what those two companies do with that money.
which we don't know as yet.
Which we don't know as yet. Whether it is just to make sure that their debt equity is in balance, or is it meant for further expansion?
So both Subhash Garg and Rathan Roy's doubts are credible doubts.
That's certainly credible.
Now, there's a second reason why people doubt this 10 lakh crore figure. It includes the 1.3 lakh given to the states as 50-year interest-free loans. But the problem is that 1.3 lakh going to the states is also part of the 3.5% fiscal deficit cap imposed on the states. Therefore, this is money the states could have borrowed themselves.
Yes.
Is it therefore additional Capex, or is it actually just a change in the source from which the funds come?
Well, you see, it will get deducted when you do the consolidated accounts, because when you do the consolidated accounts of the government, which is you put state and center together, the Capex will always be shown by the entity which is making the physical investment.
Which will be the states.
Which will be the states, right? And it will then get deducted from the central government.
That I understand.
Right. So at the end of the day, yes, Capex will be there. Whether the states would have borrowed the amount from the market, we do not know, because this is interest-free and that would carry substantial interest, about 8%.
That I understand. But if this hadn't been given to the states,
yes,
and they still had a 3.5% fiscal cap,
yes,
they would have borrowed to this extent.
That's right.
And that would really have been additional 1.3 lakh. But now, the government's 1.3 lakh is going to the states,
yes,
right? And the states won't need to borrow. So actually, it's not an addition, it's just a change of the source from which the funds come.
That's correct. So as I said, the moment you start consolidating the accounts of center and states, this will be deducted from the center and credited to the states. That's what's going to happen. So it will stand down by that extent.
So now we've established three doubts about that 10 lakh crore figure. First is what I call the Ratan Roy doubt. Then there's the Subhash Garg doubt. And now there's this accounting thing about money going from the center to the states. But actually, it may not be new capex. It's simply a change in the source of the funds.
Yes, but here's the thing. This particular window for the states to borrow, this has been around for a couple of years.
Yes.
Right? Except the states didn't take it. And this is what was the residual that was left that's been shown now.
In the years when they didn't take it, they had to borrow themselves if they needed the money. Now they won't have to borrow themselves. And that's why I'm coming back to the point I made. It may not necessarily be additional. It's simply a change in the source of the funds.
Let's see whether the states borrow it. That's the first question, because...
In which case, it might not even be at all additional.
At all. And there's a reason here, which is that under the Constitution, if a state owes the central government any monies, then the state has to seek approval of the central government for its market borrowings.
Which they may not want to do because it ties their hands.
Which they don't want to do. Lots of states have been busy trying to pay back whatever central government loans they had. And so they may not want to indebt themselves to the central government again.
So now this third doubt, which is about the states, maybe even a bigger doubt, because not only is it a change in the source of the funds, but it's quite possible that the states may not want to avail of these funds because it will tie their hands. So this may never see the light of day. It's quite possible.
It's quite possible.
All right, let's come to another concern with the increase in capex. And this is one that you spoke about last week. It is to do with what sort of infrastructure these funds are spent upon.
Yes.
Last week you said your preference would be rural roads and houses. And admittedly, the PM Awas Yojana has got a 66% increase to 79,000 crore. But 2.4 lakh crore is going to the railways, 1.62 lakh crore is going for highways, 79,000 crore on critical transport projects, 19,700 on the National Hydrogen Mission. That is, all of that is very different to rural roads and houses. Therefore, how do you view this allocation?
Well, I mean, let's be very clear on this, Karan. The allocation to railways was needed. It's a good thing it's been done. But there is no way that I can think of that the railways will be able to utilize even half of it.
So up to 1.2 lakh crore may actually be returned to the government.
Yes, because the point is that when you're talking about a sudden injection of funds, you presume that there is a shelf of projects waiting to take off and use these funds.
And that's not the case.
And that's simply not the case. The railways, whatever they're doing, incrementally they could maybe increase it by 10 to 15%, but not to magnitudes of this order.
So the first concern about the allocation of funds is that of the 2.4 lakh crore going to the railways, perhaps as much as 50%, which is 1.2 lakh crore, may never be utilized at all.
That's right.
So that element of the 10 lakh
this
crore...
year. It may happen next year, but this year
it won't happen. No. So that element of the 10 lakh crore may be unutilized.
That's right.
What about the 1.62 lakh going to highways? Now, highways usually are built with machines. They may be all used, but clearly it's not going to create a huge amount of jobs.
But again, the same question that one raised about the railways arises about highways. Highways, if you're actually completing existing projects, it'll get used. But if you're going to start a new project, it's not going to happen.
So again, a substantial portion may be unused.
Yes, because the administrative procedures such as land acquisition and so on, they take so much time. The ability to absorb the funds is limited to the projects that are ongoing.
So in the case of railways, which is 2.4 lakh crore, and in the case of highways, 1.62 lakh crore, this is a promise to make money available, but it may not be used at all.
This is
and the
a high likelihood of that.
Could be as little as 50%.
Yes.
So this is capex that is on offer, but it may not be capex that is used.
Yes.
That is another sense in which the 10 lakh crore is beguiling as a figure, but when you look at reality, the actual truth may be very different.
Yes. So what is happening is, I think there is a lot of cushion built into the proposed capital expenditures. And that's a cushion that the government, I suspect, will need, because my sense is they have seriously underfunded their revenue requirements.
Which means that the capex which is promised and not used can then be diverted to
Yes.
fund their revenue requirements.
That's right.
And if that happens, it won't be capex at all.
No.
I think the audience will say to themselves at this point of the interview that Pronab Sen has fairly effectively punctured the belief that there is actually going to be 10 lakh crore of Apex injected into the economy next year. I won't go through the reasons, but there are several reasons why we've raised very, very credible doubts. Let's then at this point come to something that's connected, which is private investment, about which there are genuine concerns. Now, in interviews that the minister and more importantly government officials gave after the budget, they were extremely confident that they were seeing green shoots of private investment. The chief economic advisor actually said so fairly vehemently. But the fact that the government is determined to invest, or at least try to invest, or appear to be trying to invest up to 10 lakh crore, clearly suggests that they are worried about those green shoots, that those green shoots will not necessarily happen on their own. So let me ask you, where do you think private investment stands? And secondly, will it be accelerated by this budget?
Well, as I said, private investment may or may not actually accelerate. But in all fairness to the government, if the government had not made these commitments in the budget, it would be running a serious risk of actually withering the green shoots.
So
Just to keep the hope alive, they had to do this.
That's a very interesting point you're making. This offer or promise of 10 lakh crore investment in capex is best to keep the hope of those green shoots alive. Whether those green shoots mature and grow is still to be seen.
Is still to be seen. But if you think about private investment wants to see sustained government expenditure over a period of time so that the demand side is propped up. And unless they have credible evidence of that, they will not come in.
So it makes sense for they want to see improve first.
That's right. And public investment is a form of demand for the private sector.
Let's then pursue that question about demand, and let's first pursue it in terms of MSMEs, which, as I said earlier, are 30% of the economy, 40% of employment. And last week you said to me, they are the most critical problem facing the economy.
Yes.
Now, the budget has several measures that are intended to help the MSMEs. There's a 2 lakh credit guarantee extended to them, and the cost of the credit has been reduced by 1%. And I'm told that 95% of the amount they forfeited for incomplete contracts during COVID will now be returned to them. And finally, I believe they could also opt for a presumptive basis of taxation, so that they don't have to pay the tax upfront. A, are these the right steps to help them? And B, has sufficient been done in terms of these steps?
Well, these are certainly welcome steps. And as I've been saying repeatedly, the government has limited instruments. If you think about all the measures that we are talking about, they are either persuading banks to do certain kinds of things, or it's really what the government really owed, in a sense, to the MSMEs. And that's a good thing. I mean, but as I said, it's limited. But there is one dimension perhaps which people haven't realized, and I think it wasn't presented very well in the budget speech, which was, there's been a bit of a hue and cry about the reduction in the peak rate of tax on personal incomes. So from 42.5%, it's been brought down to 37%. Now, this was presented essentially as something that was being given to the Indian middle class. That was how the finance minister actually presented it. But again, if you go back to what we discussed last time, Karan, one of the problems that the MSMEs face while in a situation where they're competing against the corporates is that whereas the corporates pay 23% tax, the larger MSMEs paid 42.5%.
Now it'll down to 39.
Now it's down.
That may be the best for them.
That actually may be good for the larger of the corporates. Remember, this kicks in only after a profit of 5 crores.
So even though this wasn't presented in terms of a benefit for large MSMEs, you're saying it may be most effective.
It may be a very effective benefit.
Now, last week when we were talking about MSMEs, you said that they constitute a conundrum for the government. A, because they are the most critically affected sector of the economy, but B, as you added, there's no direct and obvious thing that the finance minister can do. So let me ask you this. How much of that conundrum is resolved and how much of that conundrum continues and remains a serious concern?
The conundrum continues until we have credible evidence that the MSMEs are bouncing back, which we don't as yet. That conundrum will remain.
And what's your hunch? Will these measures, including the taxation measure you mentioned, actually make the majority of MSMEs bounce back, or do you have doubts?
In terms of the existing MSMEs, I think there is enough there for them to consider expansion. Whether this will incentivize new MSMEs to come in is really the question.
And we need that.
That is what we really need, because that's where the real loss took place during the pandemic. About 20% of the MSMEs simply closed. Now, so you can have a situation where the larger MSMEs remained and they are now being incentivized to grow. But we do need the new MSMEs to come in and fill in that void.
And that's a pretty substantial void of 20%.
Yes, it is a substantial.
And we don't know whether that will happen.
We don't know it. We still don't know that.
So in that sense, the conundrum continues.
Yes. And will continue for a while, I believe.
Now, the other element of demand was something you also spoke about last week. You said the finance minister needs to find ways of putting money in people's pockets so that they increase their consumption, and that in turn creates the demand for which, as we've already established, private investment is anxiously waiting. Now, the finance minister claims in all her interviews that she's done a lot to put money into people's pockets and improve consumption. She pointed at, for instance, her increase in deposit limits for senior citizens, the direct taxation benefits that she's given them, most importantly, the big boost to Capex, and she also talked about tourism. Will that be sufficient to actually create an increase in consumption and the demand that the economy needs?
Yeah, at the end of the day, Karan, it depends upon, you look at all the measures, it depends upon whether income is being generated in their hands. These are essentially for income that already exists. You're trying to persuade them to spend more. So if you think about the income tax, for instance, you must have the income to be taxed before income tax reduction helps you. The real question that we've been asking is what happens to the generation of fresh income for this category of people. And that is intimately tied up with the story on the MSMEs.
Absolutely. And if that 20% gap is not filled, then the generation of income, and through the generation of income, consumption and demand, all fall into question mark areas.
Yes, they do.
And maybe even more serious.
No, what you're doing in effect is your people who are already earning and will continue to earn, you are persuading them to spend more. The question is, will they spend more? First of all, if you look at what's been happening over the past year or so, the driver of growth has essentially been consumption. So you and I who have incomes, we've been spending. Have no doubts about it.
But those who
whether this
can't.
is going to persuade me to spend more, I don't know.
And
maybe,
also,
maybe not.
And also, it's not just whether this will persuade you and me to spend more. There's also the question, those who don't have incomes can't spend more because they don't have it.
That's right. So that takes us back to the MSME issue.
Once again, and I'm using that deliberate phrase, we're puncturing some of the initial impressions about the budget. You've raised a fairly considerable amount of concern whether MSMEs will bounce back, whether that void of 20% will be filled. And if that void of 20% is not filled, it goes on to raise equally worrying concerns about creating demand, because if that demand is not created, we go back to the earlier concern, there's no incentive for private investment to come in. So there's a circularity over here, but the problem with the circularity is that unless all three move and grow, not one will do it on its own.
No, but something has to kickstart. I mean, not all three can move simultaneously. Something has to kickstart the process.
And presumably that is MSMEs and demand.
Well, the government believes that it is high capex, right? And that may well be true. The point that I've been trying to make is the kind of capex matters, because if the problem area is the MSME and the incomes being generated at that level, then large-scale projects do not help.
Absolutely, and highways are made by machines.
Yes.
So this is where we come back to that issue we raised earlier. It's not just the quantum of the capex, which we've raised doubts about, and whether it will be utilized, which is another doubt, but what it's utilized for.
Yes.
And if it's utilized for projects that require machines, then you're not creating employment, which is not creating demand, and which won't lead to consumption, and therefore the private investment that you want to kick in will remain hesitant.
Yes.
All right. As I keep saying, we're puncturing holes in the initial impression of the budget. We're doing it fairly continuously. Let's come to an area where historically we've always under-resourced ourselves: health and education. Now, if newspaper reports are accurate, the allocation in the budget this time for education is 2.9% of GDP. For health, it's 2.1% of GDP. But both of those are substantially below what people think are the necessary targets of 6% and 3%. Tell me, what are the consequences of continuing to under-resource health and education in a country like India?
Well, in the case of the central government, the provisioning for health and education isn't really that critical, because the dominant action lies with the state governments. And the center main role is in institutions of eminence of various kinds, which is really in higher education, not so much in schools, and in hospitals. But primary and secondary health care
is in the
and
states.
Almost all school education is in the states. So if you're really interested in pushing these two areas, the states have to be enabled to step it up, because that's where the real lack is.
That's where the money should be going.
That's where the money should be going, and that's where the states should be spending. Now, the fact of the matter is the states have been just as guilty as underinvesting in these two areas as the center has.
Absolutely. This is the guilt that state governments and central government together share.
Absolutely.
And the problem with this guilt is that they don't seem to be doing very much to reverse it.
No. At least in education, there's some movement. On health, very little.
So we will remain with a poorly educated workforce, and a workforce that's not necessarily always in the best of health either.
That's right.
And that will be a drag on our economy.
Yes.
And that continues. And it seems to be something governments are theoretically aware of, but not doing very much about.
No. And, this has been a long-standing problem in India, and it's something I've never understood why these two, to our mind, critical elements of our lives don't seem to have any real political leverage.
And the sad part is that this rather sad story, goes all the way back to Jawaharlal Nehru.
It goes back a long time.
Okay, against this background, let's come to the fiscal deficit. Last week you said to me that this was a tricky problem for the government, because the finance minister has to A, try and reduce it, but B, she has to at the same time put money into people's pockets to create consumption and demand. And what she claims she's done is to reduce the fiscal deficit for next year by 0.5% to 5.9%. But Ratin Roy claims that in fact this is not really a reduction of the right sort. He says this reduction of 0.5% is almost identical and equivalent to the 0.4% reduction in the expenditure GDP ratio. And if he's correct, it means she's cutting the fiscal deficit by cutting expenditure. Is that the best way of doing it?
Well, the expenditure had to be cut. There's no question about it. There was a lot of expenditure that was undertaken during the pandemic years, both for disease management and relief. The requirements of those are now substantially less, and that cut should have happened and will need to happen. The point is that if you again think about it, we are back to where we were in 1920 in terms of GDP.
You mean 2020?
2019, 2020. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. It's now, in this kind of a situation, one really needs to look at what was the expenditure of the government in these 2 years, in the current budget and what it was in 1920, relative to GDP. And the current is still very, very high. I mean, it would need to go down by at least another 1 percentage point.
But would she not have been better advised to reduce the deficit by increasing disinvestment and asset monetization? This year, the disinvestment target is lower than last year, and even worse, this government has established a reputation over the last 3-4 years of completely failing to meet.
Well, Karan, let's be very clear on this. I mean, after the Vajpayee government, no government has been able to do disinvestment worth the name, right? But on this particular occasion, my personal sense is that this would be the wrong time to do disinvestment. One of the things about disinvestment is that when you disinvest, you are actually eating into the corpus of funds that private investors would use for investment. So when you disinvest, you are going to actually reduce fresh investments.
And when you want to encourage private investment, it's the wrong time to do it.
This is the wrong time to do it. The right time to do it is when private investment is on a growth path.
So on this issue of the deficit, you don't share the doubts raised by Ratan Roy
on this
that the deficit has been reduced by reducing expenditure.
Yes.
Expenditure had to be reduced, and as you say, it has to be reduced further.
Yes.
Nor do you share the concern that she should have tried to cover the fiscal deficit or reduce it by pushing up disinvestment, because you say this is the wrong time to increase disinvestment. It will take away money that should be going into private investment.
New investment.
Into new investment.
Yes.
That won't happen if you're absorbing it into disinvestment and privatization.
That's right.
Let's then come at this point to issues that matter to people, and once again, they're directly connected to consumption and demand. I'm talking about jobs, I'm talking about unemployment. Not only does India have high levels of unemployment at the moment, but there's also, as you explained last week, disguised unemployment.
Yes.
And worse still, you have a falling labor force participation rate. It's fallen below 40%. So clearly, creating jobs is a necessity. Only when you create those jobs will people have income, and only then will they create demand. Has this budget taken credible, meaningful steps to create jobs?
Well, that again takes us back to the whole discussion on MSMEs. Has the government done enough for MSMEs? And as I said, it has done a lot within its powers for MSMEs which exist. Has it done anything to encourage new MSMEs to emerge, which is where the new jobs are going to get created? When MSMEs expand, they start behaving more and more like corporates. They start becoming more capital intensive and employ less workers. So you need new MSMEs to come in to provide that employment push.
And that's where you have doubts.
That's where I have my doubts.
And if those new MSMEs don't happen, you won't be creating new jobs.
Yes.
If you don't create new jobs, not only will unemployment remain or possibly get worse, but the demand that comes with new jobs won't be happening.
Won't be happening.
And
that is the concern that I have.
And that in turn won't give the incentive to private investment that it badly needs and wants.
Yes.
In this context, how do you view the decision to cut fairly substantially the NREGA budget by 18%? At 60,000 crore, it's the lowest in the 4 years of the second Modi government. And the Times of India says that if you take into account inflation, it's the lowest in 10 years.
Yes.
And this is at a time when, for most months of the financial year that's ending, demand for NREGA was greater than the last pre-pandemic year. So is it wise and sensible to be slashing the NREGA budget at this point?
Well, I don't know about wise and sensible, but it's something that governments have done repeatedly, knowing full well that since Manrega is a demand-driven scheme, they're going to make provisions later.
And they did that last year.
30,000 crores, more than 30,000 crores. And so you underprovide for it now, which makes your fiscal deficit estimate look better, with the full assurance that you're going to have to shell out more come October or November.
And then you have to cut something else to bring your fiscal deficit
Well,
back.
that's what I said, that you already have enough padding in your capital expenditure side. As I said, the railways are not going to be spent. It was not going to be used.
But this ties up with the concern that in fact was expressed by Ratan Roy. If the sort of expenditure you're cutting to make your fiscal deficit target look acceptable is actually NREGA expenditure, then you know at the back of your mind, in due course, you're going to have to be coming up with revised estimates and putting that money back in.
Yes.
And therefore, you're relying on the fact that you padded Capex and it won't be used.
Yes. And the government is also taking comfort from the fact that both the food subsidy and the fertilizer subsidy are down. Now, the food subsidy is certainly down because the free food grains are not going to be provided. Fertilizer subsidy, it's up to what happens to the global oil market.
Absolutely, and we don't know.
We don't know.
You may have to revise that again later on.
We may have to revise that again. Everything depends on when China opens up fully and starts consuming the same level of energy it used to.
There's a fascinating corollary that emerges out of what you've just said, which is to do with the 10 lakh crore Capex. It looks good. It made the government get good news coverage,
yes,
and it made the economy cheer up and the stock market cheer up.
Yep.
But the second thing is, because as you've pointed out, it's so obviously padded, you've got the reserves when you have to revise your NREGA and if you have to revise your fertilizer, right? You can just take it from there and put it here. And that still allows you to retain your fiscal deficit.
That's right.
So this 10 lakh crore serves two purposes. Good publicity, it cheers up the economy, but there's enough padding there. If you've got your expenditure wrong, you can shove it there instead.
That's right.
Let me ask you one question which was raised by Mr. Somnathan, the Financial Secretary, when he was questioned in interviews whether the government had made a mistake slashing NREGA by 18%. He said that this is more than compensated for by PM Awas Yojana and particularly PM Gramin, which applies in rural India, and Jal Jeevan. Both of those, he said, will be putting money into rural India where NREGA operates, and therefore don't look at the cut of NREGA as something that's worrying. This will more than make up for it.
Two different types of people. If you're looking at rural India in its collective, yes, I think he has a point. But think of what the Jal Jeevan Mission or Gramin Awas Yojana. These are people who are essentially not agriculture dependent. Manrega are people who are agriculture dependent, and agriculture is unable to provide them with sufficient income for a decent life. So two very different categories of rural people.
So although the money for both is going to rural India, NREGA caters for a different category of people. And therefore, if that category lose NREGA funding, it's not compensated by Gramin or by Jal Jeevan.
To a little extent it may be.
But a lot is not.
But a lot is not.
In which case, let me ask you directly about what has been done about agriculture in this budget. For instance, there's a 20 lakh crore agricultural credit scheme. There's an agricultural accelerator for startups, a huge focus on millets, and also new storage facilities. How much will that add to rural agricultural incomes?
Well, I haven't quite worked this one out. My suspicion is, well, the agricultural warehousing was an absolute essential. I'm happy that they're doing it, but that doesn't really add to agricultural incomes very much. What it does add to essentially is smoothing out of the food economy. But insofar as the other two are concerned, they do have the potential of helping.
The accelerator and the credit.
That's right. The credit part of it in particular. The reason I haven't been able to work it out is I'm still trying to figure out whether or not this is simply a substitute for the bank credit that agriculture was getting anyway.
If it is, then it's nothing new.
If it is, then all that happens is that the bank's requirements would go down.
In which case, if it is a substitute for the banks, then the hope it holds out is a much more diminished hope.
Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure.
Okay. Finally, the finance minister believes, in fact she announced this, that nominal GDP growth next year will be 10.5%. And most people have concluded from that real GDP will be somewhere between 6 and 6.5%. Now we know that the Indian economy is not going to get any lift from the international global situation. If anything, exports could fall and that could be a drag for us rather than a boost. Therefore, has she done enough in her budget to fire up the domestic economy to reach that 6.5% level?
I don't think so. But then if you think about the 10.5 and if you think about what RBI has been saying, RBI does not expect inflation to come below 5% next year.
Which means real GDP, if you're
so real GDP is really 5.5.
And that's your expectation?
Mine is somewhere between 5 and 5.5, yes.
Between 5 and 5.5?
Yes.
We've come to the end of this interview, but I'll just put one impression to you, because I think it's the overwhelming impression that the audience will get. That a lot in this budget, in presentational terms when it was delivered on the first, looked good. But when you dig deeper, whether it's in terms of the fine print, or whether you ask questions about whether the full Capex can be utilized, or whether you look at the nature of the fiscal deficit and the way it's been brought down by cutting expenditure, a lot of the gloss seems to disappear. And the image that's left of the budget is very different to the initial impression we had.
Well, Karan, I mean, you cannot fault governments for trying to put a bit of glitz and glamour into the budget.
You're very generous. It's part of a politician's job to make things look better than they are.
Yes, and feel better.
It's part of an economist and journalist's job to strip the glitz and glamour and show the reality.
Well, I'm not sure that the general public will thank us for it.
That may be true. They would like the illusion to remain because it's more comforting.
Absolutely.
But the reality is the truth.
Well, yes.
Professor Sen, thank you very much
for
opening our eyes to the truth.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.